Hey, welcome back to another video and welcome to my channel if you are new. Today is something exciting and new. We are going to be talking through 5 books that I thrifted, I want to say recently, but it was probably getting on for like 6 weeks ago. Anyway, I have thrifted them, I have read them, and I'm going to talk all about them, and I'm really excited to do that because one of my favourite things other than charity shop shopping is reading. I love it. So, here are the books. We have The Librarian of Auschwitz, More Than This, A Street Cat Named Bob. We need to talk about Kevin. So just a couple of points to cover before we get started. The first one is I'm discussing these books on the assumption that you've read them. So if you haven't read them, go and read them if you want to, because I don't want to be responsible for any spoilers. So just be aware I will be talking about them on the assumption that you have already read them. Secondly, I didn't read any reviews of these books before I read them. In fact, I haven't read any reviews afterwards either, so all opinions are entirely my own and uninformed by anyone else's. And thirdly, if there was a film version of these books, and there is a film version of at least a few of them, I haven't watched it because I'm one of these people, I love to read the book first before I watch a film, because then my imagination creates the characters and I picture them exactly the way they are described and how I interpret them from that description by the author. Having read the books, I absolutely do want to watch the films where they exist, because I think that it'd just be, firstly it'd be really enjoyable, but it would also be interesting to see how my perception of the characters differs from the directors, but there we go. And it's always fun to see a film adaptation, although it can be a little bit disappointing too. So let's get on with it. Our first book is The Librarian of Auschwitz. So this book follows the story of Dieter Kraus, who is a teenager when she is incarcerated in Auschwitz concentration camp. And the book follows her irrepressible and indomitable spirit as she survives Auschwitz, which is incredible in itself. She doesn't just survive, she also becomes the Librarian of Auschwitz as well, hence the title, obviously. The reason this is so amazing is that in concentration camps, if you were caught with a book, that was punishable instantaneously by death. The stakes were incredibly high. And Dieter, at the age of 14, became custodian of the 8 books that the prisoners had been keeping secret, and they were using them to teach children. So it was incredibly important to keep these books safe. They were incredibly tatty, they were treasured, and they were highly dangerous as well. So the resourcefulness that Dieter displayed was incredible. She had her dress altered so it could accommodate books, and she could actually carry them around to people without being obvious that she was carrying them. And she found numerous hiding places as well to make sure that the books could be kept safe and that no one would be caught with them as well. It was incredible what she did. I mentioned earlier her irrepressible and indomitable spirit. I absolutely was... It's incredible to think how resilient the human spirit is, and she just wouldn't let things get her down. It was so incredible. She describes having 3 people to a bunk sometimes, which is incredible really. So this particular bunk mate, Dieter is always polite to her, always trying to draw a smile out of her, and she never gets it. She never gets any kind of response other than a grunt until the very last day when the bunkmate is taken away by train, and then she runs up to Dieter and tells her name. And it's such a simple interaction, but it's really poignant because you then obviously find out what happened to the bunkmate, and it's incredibly distressing. The themes of this book are, perhaps unsurprisingly, survival, defiance, and triumph of humanity over inhumanity. Dieter is the most incredible person when you consider everything she went through. Her father passed away from illness in the concentration camp, and her mother became ill and died very shortly after they left the camp, which must have been heartbreak upon heartbreak. The author actually met Dieter many times over the course of writing the book, and he describes her as she is decades later, and she's still on the go and squeezing every drop of experience from life, which I think is incredible testament to the strength of the human spirit, and her in particular. The book's interesting because although Dita is the main character, it doesn't follow her exclusively. There are some other scenes where it's necessary for storytelling for us to see from other characters' perspectives, which is interesting. It's written in a really easy to digest way, simple yet elegant sentences which are very easy to absorb, which makes it all the more horrifying, to be completely honest. The opening paragraph really got me, it hooked me straight away, and it's so horrifying. I'll read you one of the sentences actually. In Auschwitz, a human life has so little value that no one is shot anymore. A bullet is more valuable than a human being. And there's a few descriptions along that vein, but it's described so coldly and so remotely. It feels almost like someone is talking through their shock and their trauma, and gave me horrible goosebumps when I read it. So what hit me most about this book? There are so many things. I think the way the atrocities are described, I think it's described in a simple and straightforward way, factual almost, and that makes it all the more shocking. There's one chapter that deals with nearly 4,000 people being taken away from the camp by train and murdered, and the description just gives the number of people and the date, and it's very simple, no fuss, but it's so hard hitting. I think it really reflects the ruthlessness and the unflinching evil, I suppose, of those places. No remorse, no conscience, just doing it. And this was done throughout the book, so several times my eyes froze on the page at what I was reading. Now, it was a hard read and I cried numerous times reading it. I'm so glad I read it, and I would absolutely recommend it if you haven't read it, because even though I studied history at school, I think nothing brings it to life than reading about someone who was there and whom you root for and you come to love as a character, even obviously knowing that they're a real person too and they lived through it and thankfully survived. Nothing brings it to life more than that for me. Whew. So, I would recommend this book. I'm gonna have a sip of water and then we'll get on to the next book. This is my Halloween mug. If you're looking for something more light-hearted, we will get there, but not quite yet. We're moving on to More Than This by Patrick Ness. This is a really, really interesting book. It's sci-fi, but also has flashes of family drama as well, because you see through flashbacks that there was a very traumatic and tumultuous time that the main character has with his family. He's working through this kind of trauma and coming through it, which is great. So themes, this is life after death and coming to terms with events and your part in them and kind of processing things. So in a nutshell, this book is about a teenage boy who drowns in the opening pages, and he wakes up in the next chapter in his childhood home across the pond. He's woken up in Britain, whereas he drowned in America. It transpires that he's had, by way of a bit of a fluke, a Matrix-style awakening, and he is back in the real world, whereas his whole previous life was a dream. This is a really interesting book because when you look at it, it's a hefty book, but you only really encounter 4 main characters. You do encounter some others by way of a flashback, but the main book is about 4 main characters. So you've got Seth, who is the MC, the main character, and then he meets Regine and Thomas, who live in England, where Seth has woken up, and you also meet the driver, who is the villain of the piece, and more on him shortly. It's really interesting because everyone except for the driver has to come to terms with basically their own death. The scenario surrounding each of their own deaths, all traumatic as you might expect. It's really well handled and so interesting as well. How do you deal with the circumstances of your own death? I mean, but all 3 of them do have to. There's one particularly traumatic scene where the driver is trying to put Regine back in the dream world so that she can relive her death and then die properly. That's a horrible thought on its own, but the process kind of malfunctions, so she actually ends up, for a few minutes anyway, constantly reliving her death scene, which is horrible. It was quite disturbing to read and clearly very traumatic for the character, but thankfully she is saved. And I think the book really neatly illustrates the problem with living in a dream world, notably when you wake up, what happens. And in this book, the driver will come for you, because due to a slight quirk in the kind of process, the three main characters, they all went to sleep and entered the dream world separately from the rest of society or their local kind of area. So when they wake up, the driver has to go and get them, and he wants to put them back to sleep so that they relive their deaths and then die. Because if you die in the dream world, you're supposed to die in real life, which is, ooh, creepy. The driver himself, or itself, is a kind of cyborg, and he relentlessly pursues the characters. So actually there's a lot of scenes that are more thriller-esque than anything else. And I don't mean like the Michael Jackson zombie thriller, although the cyborg's not a zombie. It has that kind of constantly tense suspense feeling, which is really well done. So what I liked most about this book, it's a really fresh take on life after death. Now it does have kind of similarities to The Matrix in that they wake from a dream. They believed that this virtual reality they were living in was real, and then they woke up and found it wasn't. But for me, I think that's where the similarity ends, purely because in the book, there's a scene that describes how people voluntarily go into the kind of virtual world or the dream world. Although actually, if you read it carefully, it's sort of implied that they don't really have much of a choice. It's a thinly veiled, you're going into the dream world. So that's quite interesting, actually. The dream world is basically humanity's answer to saving the planet and humanity from humanity. Maybe I haven't explained that brilliantly. It's hailed as the saviour of humanity, essentially. And again, one thing to note, this book has an amazing hook. The first couple of pages describe the main character's demise. He drowns, and there's one particular line that describes quite a gory part of the death, and that had me wincing. And every time I thought about it, it had me wincing. But it's the mark of a good book is that even when you read something that makes you go, oh, you still want to read more. So I would recommend this book if you're looking for an unusual read, because it's definitely that. I'd also recommend it if you're looking for a book which asks and answers some huge questions, but centres only on a few characters. And I must admit, I think that really helps to be able to digest the big philosophical questions that the book is answering. So I'd recommend. Right, on to a much more uplifting book, A Street Cat Named Bob. This I've wanted to read for quite some time, and I was really glad when I saw it in the bookshop. So it is all about a man called James who's written the book, and he's recovering from drug addiction. He's getting his life back on track. He's been homeless and he's doing well, but he hasn't kind of got the magic and the spark back in his life yet. And then he meets Bob. Bob is a ginger Tom who is the most intelligent cat ever. And the two of them, it sounds like a cliche, but they instantly hit it off. There is a massive bond there, huge amount of loyalty, the tenderness and the concern with which he deals with when Bob gets frightened and dashes off. It really pulls at your heartstrings, and you can feel his anguish, but thankfully, everything turns out okay. It's told in a really informal and friendly voice. It's really easy to read. I think in terms of all of the books that I'm going to be talking through, this is the easiest read. Key themes in this book: belonging, healing and recovery. Now, although I had wanted to read this and I knew it was about a cat, I had worried that being about drug addiction, it might be quite gritty, brutal, traumatizing. But it's not like that at all. It's much more about how love basically helps you be your best. And it's so lovely, and it's so heartwarming as well. They become a little family unit, and the book is such a lovely read. And it's all about the importance of connection as well. Having that connection, having that love and that loyalty and responsibility of taking care of somebody else. Those things can really bring you back from the edge and be the making of you. I'd recommend this book to someone looking for an easy read about determination, triumph and hope. The next book, quite a few of you recommended this, and I was so worried that I was just going to bawl when I read it. It is Me Before You. This is an interesting book. It's primarily a romance with elements of drama as well. I may be the only person on the planet who hadn't read this by the time I got around to it. This is written in a way that's very easy to read and digest. I think it helps that the main character Lou is very down to earth, and the majority of the chapters are from her perspective. So you get her down to earth, very, very practical, very bubbly, uplifting voice all the way through. Apart from a couple of chapters where it does actually switch to another character, which is a little bit strange because when you are reading a book and it's the first person voice of the main character, generally don't swap to other first person voices, but it was interesting and it worked. So that's the main thing. 3 really key themes in this. So one is control or lack of, which I'll come to. Another is letting go, which I'll also come to. And the third is doing what is right for you. And as soon as I clocked that that was going to be one of the themes, I started to realise what the ending was going to be. So I was girded against it to a certain degree. This is about a man who is physically limited by an injury that he sustained, and a woman who is limited by her traumatic past. And it's really interesting how these two very different people from different backgrounds, different outlooks on life, very, very different situations as well, physically, they come together and they do a tremendous amount for each other. The main character is Lou Clark, and she is down to earth, warm, funny, very practical. I really warmed to her, actually. I think she was a fantastic main character. You just root for her and you hope everything will be okay. And then her counterpart is Will, he's quite caustic to start with. And to a certain degree, I think a lot of that is armour to prevent people from getting in because he's dealing with what he's dealing with. But I also suspect he was probably like that before the accident as well. It mentions that he was extremely high-flying in business, and I think that you have to be quite shrewd, quite observant, and probably very witty as well. And he does come across as very charismatic at times, not all the time. Coming back to the control part that I mentioned, Lou has created for herself a very safe little life. Her world is basically the little coffee shop where she works, her family home where she lives, and her boyfriend, whom seems okay, but they have nothing in common. He becomes very, very invested in a physical challenge, which Lou has no interest in, quite frankly. There's no passion there, there's no spark. He's just a safe little relationship for her to exist in. She lives at home with her parents, like I said, so, you know, the safe family unit. And then things change when she loses her job at the coffee shop, so she becomes Will's carer. Something that's really interesting about Lou, and I don't know if this is in the film actually, I've got a feeling I heard somebody say it wasn't. So let me know if you do know, because I haven't watched the film yet. There is a scene in the book which is described in such a great way. It's a fleeting reference where she gets lost in a maze. She's been drinking, she's met some people, she's been with her friends, and they go into a maze near this big castle where they all live. And there's a fleeting reference to, I put my clothes back on, and I read really fast, so I skimmed over that. And then my brain went, wait, what? And I went back and reread it, and that scene is described very sparsely. You don't really understand what happened, other than, where did she lose her clothes? Why hasn't she talked about it? And then it describes how she met up with her sister, and Lou was very distraught, and her sister took her home and they never spoke of it. And so clearly, with just a couple of very subtle references, there's some big decoding going on. She has definitely had something very traumatic happen to her. And then later in the book, this is confirmed when she breaks down and she confides in Will, and he's really the only person, apart from her sister, who knows. He's the only person who becomes aware of what happened, and he's the only person she talks to about it as well. The biggest change for Lou comes after that revelation. It brings herself and Will closer together, and she ends up breaking up with her boyfriend. And then at the end of the book, she is given financial freedom, not enough to kind of coast along with no responsibilities, but enough for her to get started and be able to get out in the world and live these amazing experiences for herself. Something else I really liked about the way the traumatic experience in the maze was described is that it kind of barely wasn't. it acknowledges something happened to the character without making it her defining characteristic, and I think that's fantastic. We need more of that. Something else about Lou as well, she's clearly intelligent. From her narrator's voice, you know that she's got the smarts, she's got a spark, she's got it. Whatever it is, she's got it. But she's almost cast in her family as the stupid sister, and certainly she sees herself that way for a while. And then her own kind of identity starts to emerge, and she sees herself as who she is on her own merit, as opposed to someone who's compared against her sister, which is really lovely. When we first meet Will, he's utterly depressed and antagonistic. He's a lot more worldly than Lou. He's very cultured, he's got a lot of refined tastes. And this is what I really liked, actually. It would have been so easy to make him look down upon Lou, but at no point did I really get that feeling. It was more like he thought, okay, I know about this stuff and she doesn't, I'll expand her horizons. And that was a really subtle and positive thing to do for the character, I think, to make him more dimensional. The best thing the author does for the character of Will is to have him go through with what he does in Switzerland. I think it would have been really easy to write the story that they fall in love and she saves him and they have a great life together. And actually that would have been lovely to read, clearly. Who doesn't love a happy ending? But it was so empowering for him to finally be able to make his own decision. And it acknowledges that he's got a great deal of suffering to come. And to alleviate his family's suffering, he does agree for a 6-month reprieve, I suppose, before he takes any action. And that's the point where his mum gets in touch with Lou, because she's looking for someone really vivacious and really bubbly to come and hopefully change Will's mind and give him all these amazing experiences, which Lou does, and she does amazingly. It's fantastic. But to be able to say, no, we need to acknowledge the fact that here's a man capable of making his own decisions, and even though he's now got, on balance, all of this fantastic experience to reference and decide if it's worth living for, he's still able to say, it isn't, I can't do it, and I must take this next step. I mean, a lot of you had said, well, you're going to need tissues. Because of that, I mean, straight away I knew what was going to happen, but I could also feel that that was the direction the book was taking. And so when it did happen, I didn't cry. I did feel sad, but it was more, I felt pleased for Will that he was able to do what was right for him. I feel like we've gone through the ringer a bit with these books. And we're gonna end on, we need to talk about Kevin. So just to give you all a bit of context, we need to talk about Kevin is my favourite book in this video by far. I mean, I think all the books I've read were really, really good. And do you know what? I'd recommend them all. I love reading, and if you love reading too, go and read them. You'll really enjoy them. And hopefully you've had a bit of a flavour for what the books are about. But this one really just ticked every box. Right, where to start? I had actually read this a long time ago. A larger portion of the book than I remembered actually focuses on the couple's lives before they had kids. And that's really interesting because you get such a good insight into their lives pre-kids and then obviously post-kids too. From a genre perspective, a family drama, and obviously huge criminal elements too. The writing style I found exquisite. There are very long, very complex sentence structures that I didn't see in any of the other books. And rather than making it a hard read, it made me slow down, because I whiz through books. I really fly off through the pages, and it forced me to slow down and absorb and savour every word. And I really appreciated the language. Every sentence, although it's long and complex, every sentence is exquisitely crafted. So if you're interested in language alone, this is a good read. I think there are lots of themes in this book. The main one for me is answering the question, is it nature or nurture that drives somebody to do something? Another question the book forces you to examine is, can you spot that? Can you spot the signs before someone commits an atrocity? And it's so cleverly done, because we're given example after example after example where Kevin does something that is outside what would be considered normal or even naughty. There's something quite off with lots of it, but it's always tempered by Eva's description of how she feels that he's not right, and for a long time she feels a little bit like an unreliable narrator, and you think, can we trust what she's saying? Obviously the parents don't spot the signs of what it might actually lean to. They acknowledge that he's not quite right, but they buy him a weapon. Well, the father buys him a weapon. The mother leaves him with childcare responsibilities against her better judgment. So clearly they don't think he's capable of what he then does. It's interesting how he chooses his victims as well, because it looks very much like he selects his victims based on people who have passions, who have a defining interest that drives them, and Kevin has none, and he slays them, and it's awful. It's awful to read. Even the teacher that he chooses, the one teacher, is someone who's really invested in Kevin and really interested in him. And the twist, the horrifying twist, which I'd forgotten about, is that at the end you find, literally the last few pages, you find he slayed his father and his sister as well, which is heartbreaking, and I was very upset when I read that because I'd completely forgotten. And their only crime is the father is always trying to build a bond with Kevin, and his sister loves him unreservedly, even though it's heavily implied that he partially blinded her. It's, there's so many nuances and subtleties, and all the characters are really complex, which makes it so fascinating. They're all so nuanced. It's such a good read. The only one who survives who's close to Kevin is his mum, Eva. And I found that really, really interesting. She's the only one who affects disdain for him. She's the only one who keeps him at arm's length, and he feels very rejected by her. Eva, the mother, is such an interesting character. I took an instant initial disliking to her. She seems so selfish and self-absorbed. And then when she has Kevin, she's clearly suffering from postnatal depression. And that changed my feelings towards her. I felt very sorry for her then, because that must be unimaginably hard. And then when you offset it against the fact that, I think she references once briefly that she has the money to live somewhere nicer, but she's in this horrible ramshackle little apartment. She's clearly doing it as penance, and she's working somewhere that she could do it with her eyes shut, basically. It's a really easy little job for her. And she's downsized her life so much, almost like Lou actually in Me Before You. She's downsized her life into this tiny little bubble, and she goes and sees Kevin once a fortnight, and that's a nightmare in itself because they're constantly at each other or they sit in silence. She's always paying for what he did and what she perceives as her part in his upbringing that potentially caused him to be like that. 2 further points about this. So the ending is brilliantly done. Just like the rest of the book, it's marvellous in that you get that real horrifying twist that he has also killed his father and his sister, and Eva finds them, and that is so awful. So awful. But then the final scene is Eva going to see Kevin, and he finally betrays a bit of emotion that he's going to be moved to the adult jail because he's reaching a certain age and he's terrified, and she gives him a hug. And it's so skillfully done because it's literally just a mum comforting her scared child, not somebody comforting a mass killer. I actually felt sorry for him, even though I'd spent the entire book thinking, oh, he's awful, he's horrible. I actually felt sorry for this child who needed his mum, and that's what a fantastic job the author did of writing it. The other thing I wanted to say was that a good book evokes emotion, and a great book evokes complicated, conflicting emotion, and this book has it in spades. This is the book I'd recommend the most. It's just fantastic. Everything about it, from the shock factor to the beautiful use of language, to the nuanced, complicated characters, it's fantastic. This is the one. If you have made it to the end of this video, thank you so much. It was quite intense, wasn't it? Some of these books were really were very emotional, but absolutely worth reading. I'm planning to do this again. I have really enjoyed making this video, and I really hope you've enjoyed watching it. And my next one is going to be some sort of horror themed because Halloween's coming up. So I'll bung in some horror, maybe a thriller or two, suspense, and I will post something to say which books I'm going to read in case you want to read along or just refresh yourselves on those books. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great week, and I will see you in the next video. Take care. Bye.